The Jian is a symbol of Chinese martial arts and has evolved over thousands of years, from the battlefields in the early days of the Zhou all the way up to developing character, strength, and virtue in Republic-era training halls barely a century ago. Back in the 1920s and even up into the 1940s, Chinese swords were still made to hold an edge, to cut with authority, to develop the body, and to cultivate martial spirit through rigorous training. It wasn't until the Cultural Revolution and the subsequent Wushu revival that swords went from the practical, capable swords to more of what we expect to see when we think of Chinese swords. The light, very flexible, flashy swords that are quite a bit different than their predecessors. Thankfully, there has been an effort to recreate historically accurate swords from China's vast history, and in this case, the not-so-distant past. This sword is the Snow Peak, made by Chen, and it is based off of a design that was very common during the Republic era that lasted from 1919 to 1949, from the collapse of the Qing dynasty all the way to Mao's PRC. The sword is nearly 40 inches long total, with 31 inches of blade, and that puts it on the long side when compared to modern swords. This also puts it on the little bit heavier side too, with the weight of 600 grams, or 1.5 pounds. The blade itself is comprised of 1065 carbon steel and T9 high-speed vanadium tool steel, with a beautiful pattern weld. The blade has a diamond-shaped cross-section and some slight distal taper before the final curvature at the tip. The scabbard is wrapped with a faux leather, and the handle has a full ray skin wrapping for an excellent grip. The pommel, the guard, and the scabbard fittings are all made of a bright and smooth stainless steel. When we look at Republican-era swords, especially in comparison to the previous Qing and even Ming dynasties, you'll notice that there is a big difference on the scabbard fittings as well as even guard and pommel decoration. There's the huge trade from the very intricate decorations and inscriptions and engravings for a very smooth, streamlined, and somewhat simplified look. The Ace of Spades shaped guard like this became one of the more popular designs during the Republic era. And in size, it related more to the large mushroom and cloud-shaped guards from the Ming dynasty rather than the thin, zoomorphic guards from the Qing. This is also a time where peened tangs were swapped out for threaded tangs secured by a nut at the end. Now, this made it easily accessible to get to the blade or to swap out the handle if needed, and a feature that has continued even into current times. Jian also appeared to be quite robust during this time. Blades were wider with less taper along the edge to the tip, similar to cutting swords of the previous dynasties. Yet they were longer than the typical cutting Jian, emphasizing a high level of skill to be able to effectively wield the sword. Some swords had sturdy sections above the guard, like the Western ricasso, with lengths from a few inches to nearly a foot long before transitioning into the blade edge. Due to this robust construction, elements of weight reduction were implemented, such as this fuller groove that you see along here, as well as a longer handle. And this was acting as a counterbalance. Now, one of the things that has gone throughout history in Chinese swords is having longer handles for counterbalance and bringing back that point of balance closer to the guard, and not through weighted pommels like you see in Western swords. The pommels are actually hollow, but it's really the extension of the grip that gives this a little bit better point of control and point of balance. Although in the Republic era it was common to have swords with very simplified and streamlined fittings, there were some swords that had fanciful engravings on the pommel, the guard, and even the scabbard fittings. However, one of the more interesting methods of decoration came in the form of blade etching. When in the scabbard, the sword would appear as standard as any other common Jian. However, when unsheathed, all the intricacies and decorations were revealed. That's pretty cool, considering that the blade would only be revealed to certain audiences. One of the most fascinating parts about the Republic era was an effort to open up martial arts to the public at centralized locations and training halls. Martial arts masters and representatives from their respective styles were joining together, not as rivals, but as equals, and establishing martial associations and gyms, like the famous Jing Woo Association and the Central Guoshu Institute. Not only did masters from styles like Xingyi, Taiji, Bagua, Shaolin, and Wudan come together to teach under the same roof, but it facilitated a number of books to be written, articles to be published, and photographs to be taken to document each respective style. Up until this time, martial arts were kept very private and taught only from teacher to student in the school over years and years of training. This was the first time that Chinese martial arts were openly available to the entire public and included detailed photographs and written theory. Not only are we able to look back at the masters themselves and see how they held each posture, but we can also gain insight directly from them. What elements did they emphasize and how the art was applied? Beyond having the masters record their martial arts and their tactics, these books serve as an excellent way to look at the swords of the past and what they were using at their time. Looking at something like this that was a lot more robust than the current flexible wushu training swords that we're used to seeing these days. I think it's important that we take a step back and look at the practical purpose of the sword to truly understand the design. And to do that, we need to look back at this time in history to see who was using it and what they had to say about it. The Republic era was in the 1900s, and by that time, firearms had dominated the battlefield. So while yes, swords were legal to possess, they could not be openly carried in public unless it was a decorative sword for a military officer. So the likelihood of having a sword for self-defense would be similar to nowadays. Martial artists were prioritizing the use of swords to cultivate the practitioner, physically and mentally, and it is seen in many texts. But when you look at this sword in particular, it has the length of a fencing blade and the cross-section and the width of a cutting blade that you would see in the previous Qing dynasty. And when you have the fuller groove for the weight reduction, as well as the long handle to have a better mass distribution, you can really feel that this sword prioritizes practical usage like cutting and thrusting rather than just flowery techniques. These are all very practical design elements which require a lot of skill and labor to forge, especially when you compare it to the alternatives like a wooden sword that could be easily carved and shaped to resemble a sword. So what were martial artists doing with these very real and capable swords? Well, very simply, they were practicing techniques and sword drills and forms, but also they were very involved in target cutting. In fact, Laosher Scott Rodell explains that his teacher had spent much time cutting grass targets. And this is very similar to like what you see in the Japanese martial arts that use rolls of tatami matting for target training and target cutting. The masters would practice the techniques of the sword in forms training, and then they would practice and refine the cuts within the form in target cutting. And finally, they would learn how to manage distance, timing, and angle of the cuts in sparring and fencing. Now, the first two elements of this could be done with a real sword. However, it was an obvious decision to use something like a wooden sword or another substitute for safe sparring practice. I have personally tested this sword in forms training and target cutting. In forms training, I found it to excel with the techniques of Taiji and Wudan. Thrusting is accurate, the quick flip and wrist tapping techniques are agile, and the large sweeping cuts feel very comfortable. Compatibility with Choi Fut forms depends on the emphasis of technique. So forms with tapping and thrusting and drawing cuts were much more comfortable than forms with direct chopping cuts And that mostly came down to having to recover after the cut due to the mass distribution giving a forward pull. The one thing I do need to mention, and if you've seen my other videos, this is something that I always mention, and that is the weight of this sword is heavier than modern day training and performance swords. So if this is going to be your first historically accurate Jian, you are going to notice, one, the difference in the weight as well as the length. However, it is not something that is going to drastically change your training or your techniques, and you will get used to this the more you work with it. But do be prepared, because modern training weapons are made for performance and they are very light, and oftentimes at that custom length. This is something that is made for cutting, it's made for practical application, it's made to hold up contact with another weapon. The sword has a very practical and functional design. The length is important for fencing, as it gives you a reach advantage, and the weight adds cutting power. And I think that's where this sword really stands out. Cutting is extremely easy with this sword, from the razor-sharp edge to the diamond-shaped cross-section to the mass distribution and the grip of the raised skin handle wrap. Each component makes it an efficient cutter. All you have to do is guide it through your target. Also, one of my favorite aspects about this sword is that it rings when it cuts through a target, which is such a satisfying sound. In the end, the Snow Peak Jian is an excellent and functional sword. And as target cutting has become more and more popular as supplementary training to forms training, we find ourselves in a very similar position as the masters from not that long ago. If you are interested in this sword, the Snow Peak Jian from LK Chen, I will leave a link to its listing on their site down below. And as always, if you already have this sword, I would love to hear your feedback about it and your thoughts on it and anything else that I may have missed in this video. Otherwise, I appreciate your watch, I appreciate your time in this, and I hope to see you in the next video.